Good afternoon and welcome to a very special edition of the India and the World webinar series hosted at Carnegie, India. In this special series, every week for the next 3 weeks, I sit down with directors of the Carnegie Endowment in different parts of the globe to give us a sense of the world as they see it, based on the particular geopolitics of their geographic locales. Today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Maha Yahya, the director of the Michael Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. Maha's work focuses broadly on political violence and identity politics, pluralism, development, and social justice after the Arab uprisings, the challenges of citizenship, and the political and socio-economic implications of migration and the refugee crisis. Prior to joining Carnegie, Maha led work on participatory development and social justice at the United Nations Economic Commission for Western Asia. She also worked with the UN Development Program in Lebanon, where she was the director and the principal author of the National Human Development Report 2008 to 2009, Towards a Citizen State. She was also the founder and editor of the MIT Electronic Journal of Middle East Studies. Ma has worked in the private sector as a consultant on projects related to socioeconomic policy analysis, development policies, poverty reduction, housing, community development, a whole range of issues related to post-conflict reconstructions in Lebanon, Pakistan, Oman, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and a range of other places. She's the author of numerous publications, too many to name here, but a few that might be of interest includes The Unheard Voices, What Syrian Refugees Need to Return Home, published in 2018, The Summer of Our Discontent, Sex and Citizens in Lebanon and Iraq, 2017, Great Expectations in Tunisia, 2016, and many others. Maha, welcome to India and the World at Carnegie, India. Predictably, my first question is on Afghanistan. Perhaps I could just start with a broad question. How are different parts of the Middle East reading and absorbing the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan?
Hi, hello, Rudi. I'm absolutely delighted to join you today. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It just on the perceptions of, in response to your question, the perceptions to Afghanistan are, or at least the US withdrawal from Afghanistan are perhaps twofold. The withdrawal is seen as kind of marking a new era in the region, a new multipolar and uncertain regional setup. What we're seeing are Arab governments are far more worried about the apparent US withdrawal than they are about the potential for extremist politics. I mean, if you want just to kind of make it more visual for the audience, there are two images that capture US engagement in the region. One is the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And now you have the image of Afghans planes as they take off, American planes as they take off. So in that sense, there is a considerable concern with what the apparent withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, but also from the region, broadly speaking, from the Middle East and North Africa, particularly by the governments, as I said, but by people as well. I mean, from the ground, what you sense is people are very worried that the biggest advocate for democratization is now leaving. That the region has been abandoned, the people have been abandoned to their fate and to the rule of basically autocrats and religious zealots. And what we're seeing this, I mean, we're seeing this a bit concretely in the sense that there is, for example, now a concerted effort to rehabilitate the regime of, of the Syrian government and the Syrian leadership under Bashar al-Assad, who many hold responsible for the country's complete collapse and the death of almost 500,000 people, 500,000 Syrians, and not to mention 6.7 million people internally displaced, 5 to 6 million refugees, so on and so forth. So the fact that somehow there is a rehabilitation going, a readmittance of a figure like that into the world, or into the international fora again, is one of considerable concern for people of the region, if you like. And the strong people on the ground are really the leadership. So go on, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And also what we've seen is in the Middle East is, or what we call West Asia, is a mosaic, because it's an opportunity clearly for Qatar, which has had a tricky relationship in the region, especially its problems with Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago. But now Qatar seems to be very much at the center of much to do with Afghanistan, especially on the humanitarian side. Obviously, on the many years in which Doha was offered up as a place for talks, the UAE plays a very important role. The Emirates has a line, if you like, into Afghanistan for humanitarian assistance. But one of the countries that we've not heard of much, and I don't know if it's by design or by default, given its past, is the role of Saudi Arabia. So I was wondering if you could just shed some light on for us on what potentially does what role does Saudi Arabia now have in Afghanistan? One of the three countries that recognized the Taliban in the 90s, but pretty much silent in the present milieu.
It's not clear yet, Rudy. What we're seeing is Saudi Arabia actually also somewhat withdrawing from the region. And today, the country with the most, if you want to talk Gulf politics, the country with the most regional footprint is really the UAE. They have influence in Libya. They have influence, political influence. They actually have people on the ground in Libya. They have political influence in Egypt, in Yemen. They have people on the ground in Yemen. Alliances in Syria. They've opened up to the current Syrian regime. So the UAE is really playing that kind of a role. At the same time, we're seeing Saudi Arabia kind of turning away from all of this. There's also, just to mention this dynamic, and I'll come back to Afghanistan, there's clearly a UAE-Saudi competition. Their relationship is literally in tatters to some extent. The UAE is very worried about Saudi Arabia trying to play the economic hub that the UAE is currently playing. Trying to attract as much as possible of the big companies, asking them to open their headquarters in Saudi Arabia, trying to do these big projects. I mean, there's an attempt to change Saudi Arabia from the inside. The problem is that I think the leadership, particularly under Hamad bin Salman, MBS, committed some grave errors, not the least of which is the killing of the horrific killing of Khashoggi in the embassy in Turkey, the kidnapping of the Lebanese prime minister, etc. So these are things that are not easy for they're not easy for people to look away from in that sense. Now, coming back to Afghanistan, it's not quite clear yet which direction they're going. Saudi Arabia has strengthened its relationship with Pakistan. Will they use Afghanistan and a relationship with Taliban to try and create a counter pressure on Iran, similar to the pressure that's being created by the Houthis on Saudi Arabia? It's not clear. Will they, stay away from all of this and decide this is not the direction we want to go? It really is not clear at this point. And as you said, they haven't staked out a position.
Thanks, Maha. If I can just move from Afghanistan perhaps to your neck of the woods. You're in Beirut right now in Lebanon. Following those tragic bombings or the explosions that took place in August of last year, we saw the government resign. You had images of people in government out on the streets protesting. There's been a caretaker government. And very recently, a new government has come into place inside of Beirut. Could you give us a sense of how are things in Lebanon? What's the economic situation like? And what's the basic sense of politics? I heard the other day in a show, which I found to be quite alarming, is somebody mentioned that perhaps the 1943 consensus, which in a sense has kept, I guess, Lebanon together, should be remodeled. So I was just wondering your thoughts on this.
Okay, the situation is pretty dire in Lebanon. This is a country that up till October 2019 was considered a middle income country. People lived quite well. And then in the space of 2 years, it's now gone to being not even a third or fourth world situation. I mean, incomes have plummeted. There's been a massive wealth destruction. We're looking at a depreciation in the value of the currency around 90%. So in October 2019, we were looking at $1 equaled 1,500 Lebanese pounds. Today, $1 equals 16,000 pounds. And now, I mean, the exchange rate has come down a little bit. It had gone up to around 22,000 pounds as of a few weeks ago because of the political discontent. We're seeing a mass exodus of professionals, talent, doctors, professors, teachers, engineers. Everybody is leaving. There's really a mass exodus from the country. We're looking at poverty rates that are now around 60% when it comes to income poverty. The UN put out a report, this is according to the World Bank, the UN put out a report a few days ago saying 75% of the Lebanese suffer from one kind of poverty or another, whether it's related to housing, whether it's a multidimensional approach to poverty. So incomes have plummeted considerably in ways that are just shocking. Just to give a figure, a professor at the American University of Beirut, which is the top university, if not in Lebanon only, but across the region, used to earn the equivalent of, I don't know, $60,000, $70,000 a year. That's an associate or an assistant professor. They now earn $11,000 a year. Just give you that. So it's a whiplash. It's really a whiplash that people are struggling with. There's shortages of fuel, of medication, you name it, there are shortages. You go to the pharmacy and, basic things, even like Panadol, you may not find. So the situation is quite dire. And at the same time, policies that could have been taken a couple of years ago, we put out a 10-point plan to avoid the lost decade with a group of Lebanese economists, development experts, etc. Literally in January 2020. So it was three months after the protests had started. Had even just some of those policies that were proposed been implemented, we would be in a different place. I mean, fast forward 2.5 years later, we still don't have a capital control bill to prevent flight, whereas people can't even access their money. They've seen their pensions disappear, their savings, everybody's savings are gone. You cannot access them. So this gives you a kind of a flavor of the day-to-day struggle of the Lebanese. Now, on the political front, the country is made of 18 different religious sects. There is an agreement to keep a kind of a balance, at least at the level 1 government positions, a kind of an unwritten pact, where the president has to become a Maronite, the prime minister has to be a Muslim Sunni, and the speaker of parliament has to be a Muslim Shia. But that agreement has gotten mired in the political shenanigans of the leadership. The leadership today in Lebanon is the same, more or less the same leadership that fought the 15-year civil war. When the civil war in 1990 ended, what they did, it ended on the condition that the heads of the militias at the time simply moved from the street to positions of power. So they took over government ministries, etc. The Speaker of Parliament, different positions within government. To my mind, it took the war from the street to institutions. And unfortunately, what that has meant for the country is that they started treating government institutions as if they were their own private fiefdoms. So corruption was rampant, clientelism, just you name it. The consensus through which they kept the government going, I think, has now reached an end. And maybe this is what the speaker was referencing. However, I don't think the question today is about creating a new consensus, creating a new national pact. I think the direction that the country, I mean, it's actually facing one of two directions. Either we move in that direction, and usually you need a conflict to force that kind of an agreement between political parties, because there's always going to be a loser or a winner. Or you can take the 1990 Taif Agreement, which itself foresaw the move towards the deconfessionalized parliamentary elections, the creation of a Senate that would represent the interests of the different religious communities. I mean, there are mechanisms within that agreement that were never implemented. There are also contradictions embedded in that agreement, but that's a different story. So either you move in that direction and you try and actually implement that agreement to get the country out of the bottleneck it's in. Unfortunately, with the current leadership, I don't see that happening, because any move in that direction is directly contradictory to their own interests. I mean, they act like a political mafia. Now, the government that's just been selected in complete economic collapse, protests on the street, a horrific explosion that blew out half the city. And it took them 13 months after the where, you know, the different, even though there's minister that
Maha, I think we're having a...
But down the road, was there a disruption?
I think we're having... No.
You froze
I think
for a second.
Yeah, I think we're having a little problem with your internet bandwidth. Perhaps what I could do is, do you want to just turn off the video for a little while? Will that be easier? Maha?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're having a little trouble with your internet bandwidth. Do you want to just turn off your video for a little while?
Sure, let me do that.
Okay.
I think it's working now. I'll leave it for a second. If we have the same problem again, I'll turn it off then.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ma. I was just wondering, as you said, so there's a new government. Presumably one of the moves of the new government is now going to be to negotiate with the IMF, look at special drawing rights. And I was just wondering is, how present is the United States when it comes to Lebanese politics and its negotiations with the international? I mean, Europe obviously has a role, France has a specific role. I don't know what that role exactly is and how you see it, but if you could just give us a sense of what role is the United States playing, if at all, in Lebanon today?
The United States is playing a role, but frankly, Lebanon is no longer really on the radar of the United States. The whole region is not. The United States has redrawn its, if you want, its primary objectives in the region. The nuclear file is obviously one of them. The safety of Israel is another. Other than that, it's really, I mean, maritime security is a third priority. The rest is really petty details. So their interest in Lebanon really is to maintain, stabilize the country. The last thing anybody needs in the international community is one more failed state. I mean, one of the things we've seen where the United States has played a role is asking Jordan to facilitate the the transfer of electricity from Jordan. They have excess electricity from Jordan to Lebanon, but this is happening via Caesar, via Syria, which effectively means they have to agree to overlook the Caesar law, which sanctions anybody dealing with the Syrian government. This will not happen without US blessing. And actually, the conversation began in between President Biden and King Abdullah when King Abdullah visited the US in July of this past July in the summer. So they're facilitating this in that sense, but they would rather also keep Iran obviously contained. But my sense is they're moving in the direction of recognizing or, accepting that, or moving in the direction of wanting to saying, okay, we're going to have to live with this. How do we then stabilize to the maximum? And this goes back to the issue I was raising earlier, the sense that people have that the biggest advocate of democratization and of human rights is now leaving the people of this region to their fate, so to speak. The other issue, just coming back to the government, is I think it contains elements of its own implosion within the government because of the way it was formed. This is a consensus between the leadership. Everybody there is named by one political leader or the other, which means they can sabotage anything from within the government. It really can blow up internally. And there's no consensus on how to move forward. There's no consensus on an economic plan. So we have to wait and see how the negotiations with the IMF will take place, what kind of negotiations. The IMF, irrespective of the US position, the IMF anyway will not come into Lebanon, will not release funding to Lebanon unless there's a very serious reform plan in place with clear KPIs, clear monitoring, etc. I don't see the prospects of that happening because the kinds of reforms needed will actually undermine the interests of this political leadership. We have a year now until elections. So I think this government will most likely stabilize things for maybe 6 months to a year. They will at least be able to pull the brakes a little bit on the deterioration. It was happening so quickly. The country is changing beyond recognition. If you'd visited 2 years ago, a year ago, or even 6 months ago, Rudy, you wouldn't recognize it today. Things have just been escalating. Even at the security level, a lot more incidents are happening.
Just one question on the United States before I move on, Maha. Recently a US congressional delegation was out in the Middle East and North Africa. They apparently met with a whole range of government leaders, the relatively new government in Israel. They went to Tunisia. And what I found quite incredible was their readout when they came back essentially was to say that, listen, we've now pulled out of Afghanistan. And these were Democrats, by the way, largely. We've now pulled out in Afghanistan. So when pushed against this question of credibility and democracy and advocacy, they said, look, we've pulled out of Afghanistan, but we're going to be able to do these kinds of things much more effectively with a lot more money in places like Tunisia in the Middle East. Is anyone in the Middle East today buying this argument, given what's happened in Afghanistan and given the general withdrawal of America from the Middle East more generally?
At this point, not really. If you want the bottom line, at this point, not really. The Congressional Committee was in Lebanon as well. They met a lot of people. And the reaction was great. If you're saying you're still committed to this, great. But walk the walk. We don't want to hear the talk only. So I think that there is serious concern. There is serious, if you talk to people on the ground, and the sense that, again, they've been abandoned to their fate, and that this region literally is being left to either autocrats or religious zealots. And that there's no more place for people who are advocating for fundamental rights at any level. And this is, if I'm saying this as someone sitting in Beirut, that kind of gives you a sense of the broader region, because this place, Beirut, has always been the beacon of, and the place where you have the most freedom. And this is why Carnegie is in Beirut, where you have freedom of speech, where there's a fantastic cultural, intellectual life here. It's still here, and one presumes it will continue, but there is that sense of despondency, and you see it across the board. Talk to the civil activists on the ground who are trying to push for an alternative vision for Lebanon, and they feel that they have no allies anymore. There is a real concern with that. And this is where I think also the EU can step in. I know we haven't talked about the role of the EU yet. And maybe when we speak to Rosa, it will be a more, you can delve more into this. But this is where the EU can play also, I think, an important role, probably in coordination with the United States, to keep some modicum of support at that level going. And so there is an interest from the EU.
On the EU, what is the role of France? I mean, I remember watching those pictures of Macron. I think it was literally on the 8th or 10th of August of last year. It was right after the explosions took place. He came, he was people across streets were kind of embracing him in a particular way. And he made this very powerful argument to say is that until you get your politics sorted out, we're not going to be able to help you. But it's very unclear in terms of, so what role does France play and what has kind of Macron done in the last 1 year?
Well, France has a very special relationship with Lebanon because Lebanon was under French mandate. But also Lebanon, as we know it today, was created under French mandate. Greater Lebanon was announced from the steps of what is today the French embassy. So there is a very special relationship there. Macron was greeted as a savior. I mean, he was on the street way before. Actually, to this day, Lebanon's leadership did not show up on the street. All the reconstruction that took place in the aftermath of the explosion was either international support or people-to-people support. So France's role in the region has been, or in Lebanon, it's been trying to push for some sort of a deal. They've pushed really hard for the current government to be formed, and succeeded in pulling this off. But the problem is that if you go back a year ago, we're talking about reforms. The bar was quite high, and as time passed, as the political bickering and the political bottlenecks, and it was clear that the system simply was no longer functioning, and that there's no way you can move forward on anything without consensus between this leadership. The bar was being, coming down, and this is the result that we got today, where you have ministers who really represent very different, not only political backgrounds, but very different capacities. And you have, as I said, you have some pretty competent ministers, but coming from, who at the end of the day will follow the political wishes of their leadership. But you also have ministers, and you think, what are these people doing in the government at a time when the country is going through multiple crises? I mean, what Lebanon is going through today is probably the most significant existential threat to the well-being of this country and to its future. We're not talking about simply an economic crisis. We're not talking about a financial crisis. We're talking about a security crisis. We're talking about a situation where the very identity of Lebanon is changing. This is a country that's prided itself on being, exporting. It used to talk about its biggest export was its human resources, education, health. People used to come here to get better. Tourism, it's a cultural, multicultural, multicultural, cosmopolitan place. All of that is disappearing. And what has disappeared in the past 2 years has been horrific. Add to that, of course, the impact of COVID. The education sector, I'll just give one example and that's it. The education sector is literally collapsing around us, literally. The move from the private sector to the public sector is significant. The public sector is unable to cope, in part because teachers just don't want to go anymore. Their salaries have become peanuts. They can't sustain themselves. There's no fuel for them to get to schools there's no fuel to get the schools running. There's no electricity. So it's pretty dire. And I mean, they're making do now with donations and international support, but this is not sustainable, let alone trying to catch up with everything that was lost over the past 2 years. And this story, I mean, I'm sure India's facing, on the education front, is also facing a similar challenge with COVID and distance learning.
Yeah, no, we can't imagine how difficult it must be. And just one quick question that just came to my mind when you were talking is, are you big in a crisis place like this, when basic identity is beginning to be challenged in an existential way, but potentially ideationally displaced? Are you beginning to see there's a large number of Syrian refugees living inside of Lebanon. It's a large population, close to about 1 million people in a country of about 5 or 6 million. Is there are you seeing sort of ultra-nationalist sort of streams? Because you're seeing this in different parts of the world. You're someone who's worked a lot on migration, on refugees. Is there a blowback?
Until now, the blowback has been limited. It's been, what we're seeing is in two places, two kinds of blowbacks. One blowback has been, there's been a rise in anti-Syrian sentiment in some places in the country, but this has always been the case. Because of the delicate balance between the different religious communities in Lebanon, the arrival of, and the history of Lebanon with refugees, Palestinian refugees that came to Lebanon and were never able to leave, never able to go back home, and we can talk about this in a bit. And then Syrian refugees, the sense that the presence of 1 million Syrians will change the identity, at least the communal identity of the country. So there always has been an anti-Syrian mood within some sectors of the population, and we've seen an increase a little bit in this. But to be honest with you, people are just so mired in their own day-to-day challenges that even that is not, where we see this come up is in places where the UN may be supporting Syrian communities, and then the Lebanese come in and say, what about us? We're also suffering today. So competition over resources, it really becomes about the lowest common denominator. The other place where we're seeing some blowback is not against the Syrian refugees, but more in terms of, we've had it. It's more internal politics. We want to have a federal Lebanon, for example. We want a, these communities cannot live together. So let's break up the country into different zones where you have a Christian enclave, a Shia enclave, a Sunni enclave. I mean, there is talk about this, and you see more and more, I don't say more and more people advocating, but the voices are becoming louder. But this, to my mind, is completely just simply not possible, because there's too much intermingling. While you have some geographic areas that are clearly, they have one sectarian color, if you like, rather than another, there's too much intermingling. So you cannot achieve this kind of homogeneous breaks unless, again, there are serious episodes of violence.
Thanks, Maha. Just for our audience, we've got a whole bunch of questions. I'm just going to weave them into the conversation. So unfortunately, I'm not going to call your names out, but I'll try and make sure to weave them, which takes me to the next segment, in a sense, which is on Israel. The Middle East Center, your center, published a pretty powerful report a few months ago, where you made essentially pretty clear that that a two-state solution is no longer viable. And that seems to be the kind of more conventional argument now that is kind of gaining steam. There's a relatively new government inside of Israel, or at least there's a new prime minister who's managed to come into power in Israel with a very small and slim number of seats. He seemed to be an ultra-nationalist. But interestingly, what you see is a lot of the reportage around the new government seems to suggest that because he's an ultra-nationalist and because he does want to depart from the policies of the previous government, there may be an opening to the Palestinian people. There may be some opportunity for dialogue, certainly not for a solution, certainly nothing sort of something kind of major in terms of diplomacy. But do you see a change or a pivot inside of Israel when it comes to the problems in Palestine?
To be honest, no. I think that there is maybe an easing up a little bit. For example, they say they will not allow any more settlements. However, they're continuing with building permits. They'll continue giving building permits. I think the current government is interested in maintaining the status quo, diffusing tensions a little bit if it can, but there will not be really any serious move on any kind of a peace process, which of course, basically coming back to our report, leaves us exactly where we are today, which is the current situation is simply not tenable. You cannot keep an entire population under occupation in perpetuity. There is an apartheid style system in place where the rights of one community are completely denied. They have no rights actually, or very few rights. So there is an apartheid-like system in place, and there's no denying. So it's not tenable, and it cannot be maintained in perpetuity. So I don't see really a radical shift. I mean, if you look at Israeli politics in general, it's shifted to the right over the past decade or two decades, I would say. It's been that we've seen a real shift to the right, and there is no change in that sense. And I think also the other thing that the current government is trying to maintain, they don't want to go head to head with the US administration at this point. So even if you look at the Biden administration, President Biden's administration, what they're looking at is also maintaining the status quo. So, for example, they haven't rolled back on any of the decisions taken by Trump, but they're not moving forward on the annexation of the West Bank. Israel is not going to move forward on the annexation of the West Bank at this point. So I think, yeah, it's more about maintaining the status quo and waiting for some sort of a regional solution, which,
But just on the role of the United States, as the Biden administration kind of at least politically begins to settle in the aftermath of Afghanistan, do you think that the administration is going to take a more strident position when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Israel? Is that yet to come? Or do you feel that this is an administration that just wants to take a kind of keep the status quo, protect the status quo, and incrementally try and wheel back questions around sort of occupation, hamlets, etc.? How do you see that panning out?
I see them dialing back. I see the US dialing back. At least all indications we've seen so far are in that direction. I mean, since President Obama, he spelled it out clearly. There's more. They want to spend their energies on China, competition with China. They have other issues to worry about, and there's a fatigue with the Middle East. So they do have their red lines, as I said. The safety and security of Israel is one major red line. The nuclear file with Iran is another major issue. Maritime security is a third major issue. So long as these are not being threatened in any significant way, let it be. And I think they're also kind of subcontracting their previous role to different actors in the region. So Jordan is playing the one role. There's now a push for some sort of a regional security fora between Gulf countries and others. So people are scrambling to figure out new arrangements. And this is why I was saying we've kind of really moved into this kind of a multipolar setup in this region where Turkey, Russia, Gulf countries, Israel, I mean, everybody is involved, but everybody wants to be the boss.
Yeah.
Too many generals and not enough soldiers, basically, in this setup. So
in this kind of push towards multipolarity, where you've seen US leadership recede, do you see an increased role for China? We've got a couple of questions on the role for China across general parts of the Middle East, but do you see any appetite for leadership? Because in Chinese popular media, at least what you read in the People's Daily or the Global Times, the Middle East itself or West Asia itself is not necessarily central to sort of Chinese evangelizing or Chinese investments, unlike, say, Africa, certainly Central Asia, and now, of course, parts of South Asia. So how do you read the role of China?
I think people in this region like to think they're more central than they really are vis-a-vis China. So there's a lot of talk about turning east, but I'm not sure the East wants to turn to this part of Western Asia. What we've seen is China has, I mean, because of the Belt and Road Initiative, they have been doing some strategic investments. They just signed a 25-year multi-billion-dollar deal with Iran, where they have the promise of continuous oil versus China investing in Iranian infrastructure. They have deals in Algeria, and they're building a city in Egypt. So they are investing strategically as part of their broader initiative. They've expressed interest in different ports along the Mediterranean. So there are these kinds of interests, and I think China would very much like to play that kind of an economic role, which is obviously very beneficial for its own larger strategic project. But on the political level, they've tended not to want to get involved in the political quagmire, whether within countries or across this particular region. Quite honestly, I can't see them staying away. I mean, the deal with Iran is one indication. You cannot stay away from the political quagmire because at the end of the day, economics is also about politics. So choices have to be made. I see them getting involved, but not as involved as everyone else seems to think that they are.
It's quite different to what surprised many of us for years earlier when we saw pictures of the Chinese leadership with Taliban delegation. And it was very clear that the Chinese were now embroiling themselves in a part of the world that we never thought that they would, for self-interest, economics, or otherwise, perhaps for leadership. But it's interesting what you say of the Middle East. Maha, this is, after all, an India and the World sort of webinar series hosted by us at Carnegie India. So I'm obligated to ask you a question on India. And I really would kind of want your honest take is, if it ever comes up in your conversations with colleagues, with practitioners, with friends, with people in government or academics, is there a perception of India at all? In the sense, is there a kind of in the minds of at least those that you deal with, where does India fit into all of this, if at all?
It fits in at different levels, actually. One is, I think, in the Gulf. I mean, it depends on which part of the Middle East you're dealing with.
Of course.
So in Gulf countries, India has a big presence, particularly because of the expatriate community. And we're not talking just about construction workers. We're talking about middle management, upper management in many companies in Dubai and other places. So it's seen as an economic power in that sense. India is seen as a technology hub. So that there are potential partnerships there that simply have not happened and that should be happening. There's admiration for the fact that India's really been, or under Prime Minister Modi, that there's been kind of a more focus on India's India's national interests, if you like, rather than expanding outwards. At least that's the perception here. And I think finally, there was also, there's what I've heard, this kind of also admiration for the fact that India is able, with the COVID, with the pandemic, not for the handling of the pandemic, but for the fact that India is able to produce vaccines. It's at a scale where it is able to become independent internally in the midst of such a massive crisis. So the sense that we can learn a lot from India, I think, at least on certain strategic issues, I think is very much there. But there's also obviously concern also in terms of what happens to, at least again, it depends on who you're talking to, but what happens to what's happening, or what happens to the Muslim communities in India, and whether they're recognized, whether they have rights, etc. But it's all at a very diffuse level. India is not perceived as a major power at the political front. It doesn't have a footprint in the region in that sense, doesn't play a role. I think the footprint of India really is as a potential economic partner down the road. And one that has a lot to offer in that sense.
Maha, thank you so much. And just as perhaps things that India has to offer, there's a lot that your center certainly has to offer us, not only different intellectual pools within the Middle East, and down the line, perhaps that's something that Carnegie is really well placed with this global network to try and kind of build those footprints, or those common footprints. And my hope is that's something we'll be able to do down the line. But we're all thinking of you in Beirut, Maha. We know how difficult it's been for the last couple of years, especially since last August. And we're with you in our own ways. So thank you very much for spending these few minutes with us on India and the World. Goodbye.
Thank you, Rudi. It's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. And I'm looking forward to hosting you in December as part of our annual conference. So where we'll have a lot more to discuss on these issues.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks now. Bye.